All right, welcome back to this is 11, right? Episode 11 of the world-famous podcast called No Politic Here, hosted by me. My name is Isaac, and I run a YouTube channel called Overzealots, and my co-host is the most quirked-up white boy in all of the UK, Chris Kunzler. And today we are very excited and thrilled and honored to be accompanied by the wonderful Daniel Denvir, the host of Jacobin's The Dig, acclaimed journalist, author. Daniel, thank you so much for being here. How is everything going today?
It's been good. I spent some of this morning talking to the great historian Peter Leinbach, who I'm doing a 2-part series with. And then I went to yoga. And then in between all of those things, I've been very engaged in organizing for a rent stabilization ordinance that the organization I work with in Rhode Island is pushing hard in Providence. So
Nice.
a little bit of everything.
What kind of yoga?
Vinyasa.
I don't know what that is, but that sounds
I don't know what that is either.
Yeah. It's been doing yoga off and on for like 25 years, but have become more intensively dedicated the last few years. And you get strength, balance, quiet the mind.
I could use some of that, I'm not going to lie.
I think it's kind of worth also explaining sort of what the dig is, because you don't post anything on YouTube, right? It's mostly contained to Spotify, Apple Music, and things like that, right?
We have some audio files on YouTube, and we really should go on, even though I don't understand why someone would go to YouTube to just listen to an audio podcast with no visuals, but apparently that happens. So we really should put our whole archive on YouTube. But basically, it's been around for about a decade, and it really is just the most in-depth analysis and possible with the smartest people I can find about literally everything. I'm preparing to do a 4-part series on the history of Indonesia right now. Not that there's, massive demands from my listeners for a 4-part history of Indonesia right now, but it's the 4th most populous country in the world, and I think certainly the least understood country per capita in the United States. And Lenin had a great quote. I don't remember exactly how it went, but it was something along the lines of, like a revolutionary has no clue what he's talking about if he has not absorbed the maximum capacity of all human knowledge that's been generated, or something like that. And that's the idea.
I was listening to Adam Tooze talk about Stalin and how much stuff he was producing and reading as well. Like, his personal library was apparently enormous, and he made a huge amount of time to read every single day. And the proof apparently that he read all of these things was that there were huge amounts of notes in them. And you kind of compare it to, I don't know, politicians today, even a lot of people who now play a key role in establishing how people understand the world. I don't really think people read as much. And that is one of the things I really enjoyed, or I have personally really enjoyed about The Dig, because, as someone who comes from an academic background on the Middle East, a lot of people who you have on to talk about the Middle East are just people who are who my lecturers were like, oh, this is, world leading expert. Helen Lackner, I remember telling you, oh, the Houthi episode is fantastic. She's an interesting lady. Someone showed me photos of her with I believe it was the DFLP, the Dhofar Liberation, the Front for the Front for the Liberation of Dhofar, the Marxist-Leninist.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Which I couldn't really believe, because thinking about it in a time when, professors are targeted in such a way for...
She spent a lot of time in the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen. A lot of time, is my understanding.
Yeah, and just honestly, I mean, we were going to talk about it later, and I think we're probably confined to talking about Palestine-related stuff there, but also you produce something that I think is an invaluable resource, which is Thawra. And
thank you. Yeah, it's like 19 parts, I think, 40-odd hours. And the idea behind it, maybe we'll talk more about this later, but so much of the Western constant effort and intent to dominate and oppress the Middle East and the Arab world is premised on total ideological mystification. The idea that they somehow pose some sort of threat to us. And if you actually like blow up that myth and look into the real history, it's just a nonstop history of ruthless and cynical Western colonial domination and really myriad, inspiring, creative, very often frustrated efforts by all sorts of Arab political currents to just figure out how can we be left alone by the West and be, be Arab people in the modern world and throw off the yoke of colonialism. And that once you kind of have that history, I think it changes. It is the antidote to the sort of Orientalism that underpins Western colonialism. I mean, more basically, it occurred to me before I did that. I was like, I really don't know what the Ba'ath Party is. That's a problem.
I mean, is it true that it was meant to start as like a 2 or 3 episode thing? Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. After having met Abdul seems to know Abdul is probably one of the most knowledgeable people that I've ever met. Abdul Razak Takriti, if anyone doesn't know, he's he's kind of the co-host of the miniseries, but he is one of the most knowledgeable people about the Middle East who just knows everything and wants to explain everything to you, which is a wonderful trait for learning about anything. And that's
a problem if you only want to do 2 episodes.
Yeah,
he had other Abdul Razak Takriti, or Abid for short. He had other plans for what we were up to. Whether he understood that we had that he had different plans for us or not, I'm not sure. But it soon became clear that there was something much more expansive that was possible and even necessary. And his knowledge is so vast. His book is Monsoon Revolution is on the Dhofari Revolution in Oman, and it's a beautiful book that we talk about, that I draw on in one of our episodes. Just one, but then he's able to talk about everything else. Unfortunately, I mean, it's amazing how the colonial and imperial domination of the Middle East and the Arab world, the Arab East, the Mashriq in particular, has artificially divvied up all of these countries and then made them appear as though they have these kind of like, these are separate nations with separate national histories. And Abid sort of his analysis breaks through that and shows that, this is a common, this is a fundamentally interrelated kind of common polity, in a sense, the larger Arab Mashriq, the Arab lands of the Ottoman Empire, and the revolutionary movements against all the various forms of colonialism that have been imposed on that region are certainly incredibly transnational. Whether we're talking about Baathism, communism, nationalism, Nasserism, and so on.
And it kind of leads me into, well, I guess kind of what the sort of main crux of the episode Isaac and myself had planned today was to talk about the Democrats. And obviously a big part of that, and some of my favorite episodes that I've listened to, are really about the failures of the Democrats, and particularly around the topic of immigration. And one of the things you mention and kind of talked about in quite a few things of yours that I've read is basically, okay, so you can correct me if I'm getting this wrong at all, but seemingly around the turn of the millennium, there was somewhat of a cooling on immigration rhetoric, right? You did play a crazy Bill Clinton campaign ad where he's talking about doing the border
from 1996, and it looks like a Trump ad or something, where he's just like, we have sent more immigration agents to the border. We've locked up these criminal aliens.
Desperate and wrong. President Clinton doubled border agents, 1,000 more for California. Signed a tough anti-illegal immigration law protecting U.S. workers. 160,000 illegal immigrants and criminals deported. A record. Bob Dole voted against reimbursing California for jailing illegal immigrants. Time magazine says his risky tax scheme could cut 2,000 border agents, cut 4,000 FBI. Bob Dole, wrong in the past, wrong for our future.
You kind of said that there was something of a cooling around that point of like it didn't even figure into the presidential debates. You said in the video that I watched of you that
I was shocked to discover that researching the book. I was shocked about that it wasn't a big issue in the 2000 presidential campaign between Al Gore and George W. Bush. both because it's obviously such a central issue in U.S. politics today, but also because the way that anti-immigrant politics functions in the United States today was very much kind of emerged and consolidated in the 1990s. And the fact that it sort of, there was like this interregnum or interlude, but was very, very surprising to me. And I think that was, my best case guess on that is because the border patrol theater exercised by the Clinton administration appeared to work for a little while. Appeared to work.
And you said that the thing which really, once again, ramped it up was September the 11th. That
Right.
all of a sudden it was even more securitized, illegal weapons flowing in alongside illegal people, right?
Right. So, I mean, just to step back, a little bit, it emerges in the 1990s for a variety of reasons. But I think the most straightforward way to describe it is that this post-Cold War moment of free trade globalization, particularly in the United States with the negotiation and signing of NAFTA, provoked a lot of anxiety around national security, the security of the borders, the movement of things and people and money across borders. And this was sort of like how to make sense of this new world order that was emerging was very contingent and up for grabs. And the Clinton administration's response to widespread anti-NAFTA sentiment was, and this is very clear from how the administration internally discussed it. There's some great Rahm Emanuel memos on this. It was to militarize the border and crack down on the free movement of people, labor, Mexicans in particular, in order to politically safeguard the free movement of capital that constituted neoliberal globalization and the North American Free Trade Agreement. So literally it's 1994 when NAFTA is happening that the first two major militarizations of the U.S.-Mexico border take place. First, Operation Hold the Line in El Paso, and then Operation Gatekeeper in San Diego. And there's a lot more we could talk about there. So it's 1994. The North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, is happening. There's this incredible inchoate anxiety, fear around borders, around the security of borders, around the place of the United States in the world, around the place of American workers within the U.S. economy and within the global economy, post-Cold War, neoliberal globalization, how to make meaning out of these fears and insecurities is at the time a politically open question contingent on the balance of political forces in American society. And what the Clinton administration does very self-consciously, it's very clear from the memos written by people like Rahm Emanuel, what they do very self-consciously is militarize spectacularly. And I mean spectacularly, I use that word on purpose, like the emphasis on spectacle. They spectacularly militarized the U.S. border in 1994, first in El Paso with Operation Hold the Line, then in San Diego with Operation Gatekeeper. And the point is to crack down and demonize the free movement, of people, i.e. immigrants, i.e. Mexicans in particular, in order to politically safeguard the legitimacy of the free movement of capital and of neoliberal capitalism and the kind of post-Cold War system that's emerging in general. And that sort of like works for Bill Clinton in a variety of ways, just as triangulating on crime and on welfare does in terms of really like accelerating the war on crime and mass incarceration and ending welfare as we know it by eliminating it for many intents and purposes.
That's one of the things that I really like about your work, specifically All-American Nativism, the book, is that you don't treat Trump as though he's an aberration, and you quite literally say that his predecessors built more walls and cages than he will ever manage to construct. I think that's a quote. And I like the fact that you don't just show Trump and his ugly, vulgar expressions of what America has become and then act as though this is stepping away from what the project of America is as opposed to just like a manifestation of it. And I think you do a really good job of holding the more centrist Democrats, liberals, to account for the role that they played in this destabilization. And this might be a bit of a segue, because we will get back into this, and it might be completely out of the blue, but I need to know, do you know, Daniel, what frame mogging is?
Frame mogging. This might be one of those, I'm 43, and even though I'm online, not online enough.
I'm pushing 30, and I just learned about it like very recently. But it's essentially, and Chris would probably know better than I would because he's a little younger than me. But so correct me if I'm wrong, Chris. But frame mogging is when someone who has a better frame, a more sick bod, comes into close proximity with you, and then that contrast makes you come off a little bit inferior, I guess, in terms of stature.
That's a great term. Yeah, keep the excessively hot people away.
Yeah, well, I bring this up because last night I got brutally, horrifically frame mogged, and my cortisol spiked up. But I got brutally and horrifically frame mogged by Hasan Piker.
Oh my God! I mean, anyone standing next to Hasan Piker is getting brutally frame mogged by him.
Yeah.
I mean, what an Adonis.
You might know where the term comes from, because I know you were online enough to know who I was, because that's how we got in contact, right? And you know who Clavicular is, or you must have heard of him, maybe?
Yes. Yeah, it rings a bell.
Oh, okay.
So Clavicular is this strange sort of right-wing guy that there is like a lot of stuff to... He's not even right-wing, he says he's not political, but he's the guy who like smashes his face with a hammer. He takes drugs to fix his body. But this is where the term frame mogging has recently gained...
Does he do like implants to make himself a lizard?
Yeah.
Or
no,
I don't know about the lizard part.
I've not heard about the lizard part, but it wouldn't
But there's a lot of
surprise me.
modifications. There's tons of modifications.
There's a lot of body mod.
Yeah, for sure. And that's, I guess, where the term frame mog has been kind of popularized, where there's this infamous clip of him with like a frat leader of some school, just some random guy who just comes up to him and he's like hot. And I guess you could just tell if Clavicular is very insecure. Anyways, I bring this up to say that Hasan Piker brutally frame mogged me yesterday. And I'm going to show you what it looked like because it's actually embarrassing. But oh my goodness. Can you see that?
Yeah, I mean, he's looking good. I mean, you're looking good. You're just dressed a little cash with a hoodie or something.
It's the height. It's the height issue.
I think it's the height. Like, and to be honest, I wore my bulky shirt because I was like, this guy's gonna come out way too big for me.
Yeah, and you're like my muscles could be giant. They could be Hasan sized underneath that. No one knows.
I'm also I'm extremely
Exactly.
worried if I ever meet Hasan for the same issue coming up of just not being very tall, and he and a lot of other political content creators seem to be quite tall, in comparison to myself. So I fear I may go the way of being frame mogged as well.
Also, like, he comes to my hometown. I gave him this Ho Chi Minh statue that he's carrying. And then he frame mogs me, this guy.
Yeah, I mean, rude, but I mean...
The reason I bring him up is because he is in a bit of controversy, pickle, maybe, pertaining to his comments he made about centrist, maybe center-right Democrat Gavin Newsom, where he essentially said that if given the choice in 2 years from now, if he was forced to vote between Gavin Newsom or J.D. Vance, he would not vote for either of them. And that caused a tsunami, a hurricane of centrist liberals on particularly Twitter getting very, very mad at him.
Yeah. And
I wanted to ask your opinion on that because, as we just kind of covered a few minutes ago, that flavor of third way liberal, Clintonite Democrat has not really done all too much to ward off the impending threat of fascism that Trump poses. So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, I would only vote for my condition for voting for Newsom would be him getting back together with Kimberly Guilfoyle. How do you say her name? Guilfoyle? One of the Trump kids' wives. You've seen the photo of them, right?
Yeah.
On the rug. It's one of the most special images ever created. So yeah, I want that to happen again. That's my thing. But this happens all the time. There's this demand for people on the left to not only vote for whatever Democrat, but to pledge to vote for them no matter what, months, even years in advance of whatever the election in question is. And so I have a number of things to say about this. First, I voted for Kamala Harris. I think that her politics, like those of the Democratic establishment more broadly, and this is what we were talking about before and we'll continue to talk about throughout the interview, have done so much through the intensification of neoliberalism, the intensification of imperialism in the war on terror, the intensification of mass incarceration, border militarization, and the persecution of immigrants, have in so many ways laid the political, ideological, and material infrastructural groundwork for the MAGA authoritarian threat that we see today. That said, even though Trump does grow out of normal American politics and MAGA grows out of normal American politics, he does pose a, very distinct fascist threat, I believe. I also think it is so backward, and it's part of the entire project of demanding that the left pledge fealty to our political opponents in advance. It's not actually about, would it be better or worse, or what's the sort of like political dynamics of Harris versus Trump, or in this case, I guess Newsom versus Trump being in office. It is just about demanding the capitulation and surrender of the left in advance. And there's no reason we should do that. I was an alternate uncommitted delegate from Rhode Island to the DNC specifically to say, listen, whether I think a crappy Democrat would be better than Trump or not, the way you all are behaving will lose you the election. And it did. And that's what's most important. So the way politics works in a democracy, and we still do have an electoral democracy in this country to some degree, is politicians have to win people's votes.
Exactly.
Hectoring Hasan Piker, hectoring whoever else to capitulate in advance and pledge to vote for Gavin Newsom, I will not make that pledge, because that is just about us conceding defeat to the very politics that has helped create MAGA in the first place. And it's so annoying, and it happens every time. And hectoring people to vote for someone does not work. If you want them to vote for someone, you have to appeal to them.
Yeah, it just feels like it's particularly heinous to kind of expect that someone whose political beliefs are not being reflected in the current Democratic Party pledge like this blood oath to the party that is, again, not representing his beliefs, not really doing much to fight off the impending fascism, and then scolding him when he says, look, this is a democracy. I want to practice my ability to withhold my vote if this candidate does not reflect what I value.
Yeah,
it's just, it seems so anti-democratic, because that's the whole point of democracy, is that your elected officials are supposed to earn your support. And then if you just say, well, if you don't vote for us, then these psychopaths over here are going to win, it just feels like you're kind of using the brutality of the Republicans as kind of a cudgel and like a threat. Like, we don't have to change our platform, because if you don't vote for us, look who's going to come in. But it's like, why don't you kind of maybe ameliorate some of the concerns that a guy like Hasan Piker has, and then maybe expand your voter block, like we saw with a guy like Mamdani? Those are incredibly popular positions, and realistically, all Hasan is asking for is to move the Democratic Party closer in that direction. It's not like he's asking
to more popular positions.
Exactly. Like the Bernie positions, the Mamdani positions. It's not like he's asking for like a Maoist revolt. He's not acting. He's not trying to get like a protracted people's war going.
Tax the rich.
Yeah.
Let us have a few nice things and
Yeah.
deal with the cost of living crisis.
And the Democrats, they're too to the right of even that.
Yeah.
For me, I think that point of the popularity is the part that really it doesn't confuse me. I understand why they do it, but looking at the UK, this odious desire to just constantly cling to Israel and offer defense to it when, this wasn't really that large a scandal to come out of all of the Epstein stuff, but one of the UK Secretary of Health, Wes Streeting, in private messages to Peter Mandelson was like, we need to recognize Palestine because Israel is committing war crimes before our eyes. Privately, all these people know that Israel is committing war crimes. They know that they could invigorate young people who are experienced. Obviously in the UK, we got nowhere near the militarized crackdown that they got in, places like UCLA and stuff. But still, you're smeared as anti-Semitic. The universities refuse to listen to you. And many of these demands are popular and tap into other sentiments that people in universities have about unaccountability. And yet the Labour Party chooses to odiously cling to Israel because maintaining a dying status quo is apparently more important than winning people's votes.
Well, they're more committed to empire in both the UK and US. The center or center left or whatever you want to call them, the Starmer's Labour Party and the Democratic establishment, they're more committed to empire than they are to stopping fascism, and that's why it's so disingenuous and cynical when they accuse the left for not enthusiastically hopping on board for whatever fresh new hell they've offered us as a nominee. It's the very sort of cynicism that drives the mass alienation from politics that has done so much to help Trump get elected. And this is someone else's analysis that I'm stealing, and I would cite them if I could remember whose it was. But we always talk about swing, in U.S. politics, so much about swing voters in the center. What do the Democrats have to do? Campaign with Cheney or whatever to win over these swing voters who are often just like a proxy for whatever the Democratic establishment wants to do anyways, and a bit of a fantasy.
Yeah.
What do we have to do to win them over? Well, they're also swing voters on the left who are swinging between voting for the Democratic Party or voting for a third party or staying at home and saying that it can all go to hell. And it's just interesting that there's so much attention played to one category of swing voters and so little to the other, especially when our swing voters, us on the socialist and progressive left, again, like you were saying, Isaac, we have positions that are broadly popular. Some people on the left sometimes don't behave in a way that I think is very conducive to enhancing our popularity, but that's something we can talk about another time. But our actual positions are very popular with very few exceptions.
They are. They're so popular that right-wing populists have to pretend to hold them in order to gather support. The toothless faux populism is rooted in signaling these sort of left-wing populist beliefs.
Totally.
Zach Polanski in the UK, I'm sure that you both aware? His sole message, his sole message is his really basic messaging is just, hey, I have hope, and I think that we should wake up with hope and probably not be, living under really difficult circumstances where it feels as if nothing gets better. There's nothing to be hopeful about. In fact, I read some economic report on the UK, and they said 6 out of 10 people in the UK feel that we are headed in the wrong direction, and that's under both Labour, both Tories, and it's just tapping into that sentiment of hope and offering very simple messaging of hey, things should be cheaper. You should, as workers, things should be better for you, and we shouldn't sell weaponry to countries committing war crimes. Are sapping away Labour's left-wing base, and their only responses to go, no, you're crazy for this. You can't vote for these people because they're crazy. Because maybe they have. Isaac's just made a video about it, but the big green things are related to NATO. And they people really do not like NATO stuff because obviously there's quite pro-Ukraine sentiment in the UK, but it doesn't work. It's not effective political messaging. Keir Starmer is going off a cliff and he can't fix anything. And I saw someone who was just talking about it in their video, and they were like, "Why not just institute as much left-wing stuff as you can? You're done for anyway." And the fact that you're unwilling to is pathetic, because you could, if you really were committed to this ideology of making the country better, you would do things to make it better and lay groundwork for someone who isn't Nigel Farage, you know, a right-wing sort of crypto maniac, very similar to Trump and stuff, you know, who is guaranteed to win if things don't change.
Like a faux populist.
Yeah. I mean,
Daniel,
just doing some basic things to, like, okay, why are so many societies going so insane? And like laying out a set of social democratic reforms, let's say as a socialist, non-reformist reforms, that would begin to address that, like, great social and psychic unraveling that's taking place. Allow people to work less, allow for their lives and jobs to be less drudgerous, their homes more affordable, in better repair, their kids to be taken care of from universal child care, more community infrastructure so that people can spend time together IRL, because it's not a coincidence that the tech oligarchy, whose political expression, it turns out, is MAGA authoritarian fascism, it's not a coincidence that they're waging a war on our simultaneously on our sociality and literacy right now.
Yeah.
And the center left doesn't seem to get why we're in such a dangerous place right now.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Daniel, because I'm Canadian, so I could be completely wrong about this. But in America, isn't it the case that the majority of the population just doesn't even vote?
I don't know. I think it's like
or a good portion.
Yeah, it's a pretty big portion. I think with Obama, it got up to maybe around 60%, but I don't know if that's even of eligible voters or of the total voting eligible. I don't know if that's registered voters or the total voting eligible population. Don't know the stats off my head, but it's a pretty weak turnout.
But isn't that kind of a testament to what you were saying about how there's this other pool that you could appeal to? This other pool of potential swing voters.
And the poorer you get, the less likely you are to vote. That's very, very clear. Because the poorer you are in the United States, the more your empirical data that you're making, that you're kind of generating your political theory and assessment and analysis from, the more your empirical data is like, I have had no healthcare coverage, no child care, slum housing, working 2 minimum wage jobs, my brother's incarcerated, whatever. And this has been my reality under presidents of both major parties. And that is a reasonable conclusion to draw from that empirical data for people who have experienced that. And that is many millions of Americans. And it's those poor Americans who are least likely to vote.
Yeah, and they would be the most receptive to like a left-wing populist platform.
Also a very simple one. I've seen some people, I've seen a couple of philosophers who I enjoy the podcast of, Why Theory. They're like their argument is that it has to be very simplistic in the sense of, like, I think their argument was driving down rent prices, general housing reforms, higher wages and healthcare as like an incredibly basic platform that, when you look at like anything positive that the Democrats tend to do, it feels like they never treat it with any level of seriousness compared to giving money to Israel. Like there was one immigration reform that was mentioned under Biden. I'll just check this because I don't want to get it wrong. One moment. It was Daniel, you'd be way more familiar with this than I would. The Los Angeles Declaration on Migration and Protection that was given $4 billion, $1 billion per year, and regularly we saw tens of billions given to Israel, and that is not a popular thing. Giving away money, and people don't like it for a multitude of different reasons, but giving away money to Israel is not popular, and it's trying to address root causes.
Yeah, it's extraordinarily unpopular to give money to Israel, and Israel's standing in American public opinion is irreparably fucked at this point. which is not to make light of the, there's nothing that could, I can't call it a silver, there's no silver lining to a genocide, but it is one can take some comfort in the fact that Israel's legitimacy in the United States is toast, and it's hard to imagine once this political generation is forced off of the stage and into the grave that there's going to be, even amongst more mainstream figures, much of an appetite for supporting Zionism.
Which is why it's hard to watch someone like Newsom capitulate to Ben Shapiro on topics around Israel. Ben Shapiro's not even a very competent debater around Israel, because he can't hide behind the notion that he's like a liberal Zionist. He's a straight up, Netanyahu supporter, and Newsom can't even really.
That was so embarrassing. It's like,
horrible.
You're gonna debate Donald. Well, not, I guess, if Trump runs again.
Vance.
But you're gonna debate JD Vance. I forget what was it. That was such an embarrassing interview. I just saw that
Kirk,
one viral clip.
with...
What was it that he was like? What was it that he got Newsom to capitulate on so quickly?
Oh, about that it wasn't a genocide.
It's not. Of course, it's not a genocide. You get admitted not genocide.
Yeah.
Newsom's like, oh yeah,
yeah. I agree with you. I don't think it's a genocide, but I just understand why people look at those horrible images and then say it is.
But these are images, not data gathered by what anyone would consider like legitimate international human rights organizations or anything like that. This is just images on. This is like Hillary's line, like it's the kids on TikTok. She's
which amazes me.
Even B'Tselem is calling it a genocide at this point. What are you supposed to? I don't know.
Yeah.
But all of those sort of global, I mean, I don't know why they kept putting them on. There was a couple of weeks where they kept coming out with the most atrocious videos that everyone was like, why are you saying this? Like Sarah Hurwitz, I think, was the person who did the most. But none of them, it's really interesting as someone who made short form content and still does to some extent. None of them understand it, that they were all like, oh, TikTok is showing them images of dead kids. No, it's not. TikTok doesn't allow that kind of stuff to be shown on the platform. They don't even have like the vaguest grasp of what they're talking about. And what TikTok has actually done, and what I would argue I was like happy with what I did, was actually to promote things like theories about settler-colonialism, because those are the most injurious things to the Israeli project.
Yeah, if they're the historically illiterate ones. You're the one, it's the left that's like actually offering real history lessons of factual things that have occurred.
and I think that's why, like, as well, like talking, the stuff, I enjoyed how a lot of your stuff was talking, like on Border, you talk about, what California is and the decline of the native indigenous population there. And in fact, we had someone on where a couple of weeks ago, James Ray, and he was talking about Minnesota, and he was talking about how, people were talking about ICE, and the people were saying the United States of Israel to describe America. And he was like, in part, I see like the connections to do with American troops going over and training there, police officers mostly. But like, he was also like, they executed huge amounts of indigenous people in Minnesota and drove them away and removed them. And I think sometimes we need to take a step back and think, this is our history too, and Israel is an offshoot of us and an inspiration.
The U.S. is fundamentally a settler colonial project. I mean, it's just like a historical reality. It doesn't seem like a controversial position to take. It's just an assessment of what indeed has happened. People from one place from Europe, England in particular, had a systematic project starting on the eastern seaboard to ethnically cleanse indigenous people from the land in a systematic manner as they expanded across the continent towards California. And when it's the population, the Anglo-white population that was established there, living in extraordinarily intentionally segregated communities that systematically excluded Black and Latino people, particularly poor Black and Latino people, where a hysteria about being invaded by Mexicans who are deemed non-white because of their mestizo, mixed indigenous status. I mean, you can't separate these things out. It's all one big messy history, and it's why when I do think it's important to think about things like what does it mean to decolonize the United States, not in incredibly like abstract and unrealistic way, but like what would it mean to actually like refound this country on different principles. And I think we see glimmers of that. It's not perfect, but in Mamdani's election in New York, powered by immigrants from all over the world, like that's an inkling of what a much bigger decolonization project will have to look like.
I mean, also something that kind of interests me about that as well is like you kind of mentioned in some of your work how, the similar anxieties in Israel that is about maintaining a Jewish majority. In America, a lot of this immigration stuff taps into that and this longer history of, quotas to do with ensuring the right people are coming.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, this literally like ensuring compact white majorities. That was the explicit project of U.S. settler colonial expansion. It was like, okay, nope, don't go too far out yet. We need to do this in a systematic way. And that was a state project. New Mexico's entry as a state into the U.S. was delayed an extraordinarily long time after the territory was seized by the United States, precisely because it was so indigenous and Mexican that racists in Congress, i.e. most people in Congress at the time, were like, no, that's a problem. We can't have those people have a state. And so there's been a fundamental demographic sort of politics that have, it's not like there's a through line. It's not like a straight uninterrupted through line. It's not like, the sort of like, the moment Europeans arrived here and brought the first enslaved Africans, there was a certain type of racism that was formed and it stayed exactly the same up till this moment. And we can explain anything through that. But there is but white supremacy has been a consistent project, and that has been articulated itself through certain types of like projects of demographic separation, segregation, immigration control, etc.
In your book,
sorry,
right? In your book, I like how you mention you actually have a quote. It says, "Whiteness was the documented, comprehensive, and official policy until 1965, when Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Hart-Celler Act, which ended the quota-based immigration system." I like that you draw attention to that, and then you kind of compound that or accompany it with the fact that a lot of the immigrants that come to America come because America destabilized their countries. You could talk about like Reagan's wars in Central America. You talk about the Middle East, North Africa, West Asia region. These are countries that have been destabilized because of the very country that is now refusing them entry. I think when we talk about immigration, there's this lack of empathy. It's very common to see people treat these people as illegal or call them aliens, or why are they here? Why don't they come the right way? But it's like, as you say, this is a settler colony. The original inhabitants did not really come the right way. They just committed a genocide.
Yeah. To lay out some, I think, important historical markers here. I think it was 1790 that was the first naturalization law in the U.S. I could have that wrong. I don't have notes in front of me, but it made eligible for naturalization any free white person. That was the law. Around, at that moment in U.S. history and in years prior, extraordinarily large numbers of enslaved Africans were being imported here, migrated here against their will. In the 19th century, there was, beginning in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act to bar Chinese laborers. That then expanded to other Asian countries. By 1917, 1921, 1924, you had increasing restrictions against basically all Asians, with some exceptions such as Filipinos, because the U.S. had seized the Philippines as a colonial possession in the Spanish-American War, but also disfavored racialized European others, Southern and Eastern Europeans, Italians, Jews, etc. And that was the law of the land until 1965. And that whole time, the people who were imported, the labor that was being imported to substitute for the barred Asian labor and the heavily restricted European, Southern Eastern European labor, were Mexicans. And the thing is, you always need someone to do, in the U.S. capitalist system, you need someone to do forms of degraded labor that is poorly compensated and seen as extremely low status. And so how do you do that in this kind of democratic white republic where, white people are supposed to be equal? Who's going to do that labor? Well, that's where enslaved Africans come in. And later on, that's where Mexicans come in, and that Mexican migration during this whole period of intense immigration restriction from the late 19th century to 1965, Mexican migration in the Southwest in particular, but increasingly spreading to other parts of the country, is where this imported, degraded, degraded and thus racialized labor is coming from. And it's coming in different ways. It's coming because people are crossing the border without authorization illegally, but it's also coming in huge amounts from World War II through, I think, 1964, through a program called the Bracero program, this guest worker program. And so at the same moment that the kind of explicit racial restrictions of immigration law are eliminated in 1965, at the same moment you have the end of the legal guest worker program to bring hundreds of thousands of Mexican workers a year to do agricultural labor. And then over the next decade, you have like new countrywide restrictions imposed on immigration. I don't remember the exact years here, but it's basically a similar cap for every country. So whether you're Mexico or Uzbekistan, you get or I guess Uzbekistan is part of the Soviet Union at the point. Let me choose a different example. Whether you're Mexico or Malaysia, you get, 20,000, I think, visas a year. Okay, so we have this whole labor migration system in place where Mexican laborers are coming in to do the most degraded, least compensated forms of labor in large numbers. That's an economic reality and social reality and human reality that's in place. And suddenly, there's no legal mechanism for that to happen. So this pre-existing Mexican migration system, that's a product of a number of things. One, of the racial exclusions of the U.S. immigration system in the late 19th and early 20th century, and of the fact that the U.S. is fundamentally entangled socially, politically, economically with Mexico from at least, definitely since from the moment of the U.S. seizing the northern half of Mexican territory in the in the Mexican-American War. There's this massive migration system in place in between the U.S. and Mexico, and that's suddenly just illegalized and then appears in the guise of illegality. And that's where the idea of there being an immigration crisis kind of first, a Mexican illegal, quote unquote, immigration crisis emerges from.
Yeah. You talk explicitly about how these new laws and this crackdown turned this circular flow of temporary labor into this permanent population of people who are now illegal. And then it would kind of make it so that the Mexican people who were in the U.S. didn't end up leaving, going back to Mexico because it was too dangerous to cross the border. And then you actually mentioned how because of this, they started to take more dangerous routes through Arizona deserts and put themselves in harm's way, all because, and this is something I wanted to ask you, do you think, because again, this is a bipartisan thing, this crackdown on immigration, do you think the Democrats' focus and capitulation on this topic is to avoid is them avoiding talking about bread and butter economics or topics like Israel, which are popular, which they are very bad on? And do you think this is just their way of kind of focusing on something else that they can rally support on?
Yeah, I mean, again, like going back to the 1990s, the demonization of quote unquote illegal Mexican migration, of humans crossing borders, is all about bolstering, defending the political legitimacy of capital crossing borders, of neoliberal economic globalization. And then let's, that this 1990s moment of NAFTA, like we were discussing earlier, that's really foundational to contemporary anti-immigrant politics. Like the anti-immigrant politics we see with MAGA and Trump now, we see it emerge there in very bipartisanly between the Clinton administration, congressional Republicans, Republican California Governor Pete Wilson, who campaigns on this really draconian anti-immigration ballot measure called Prop 187 in 1994. All of these people co-author the nativist anti-immigrant politics in the 1990s. The next big kind of moment in the development of anti-immigrant politics emerges in the wake of the War on Terror. It doesn't exactly emerge in the way that people tend to think. And this is a complex argument. After 9/11, like immediately after the World Trade Center was hit, there was assaults on Muslims or people who appeared to be Muslim to ignorant people like Sikhs. There was intense government repression, long-term detention of immigrants from Muslim-majority countries. But actually, at the time, the governing philosophy of the George W. Bush administration was neoconservatism, and they wanted to articulate the war on terror that they were launching on capital L liberal principles around universal human emancipation. And that might rightly appear to us to be insane. It appeared to me to be insane contemporaneously as 18, 19-year-old or whatever at the time. But knowing what we know now about what happened with the war on terror and the invasion of Afghanistan, Iraq, it is empirically insane. But that was the political articulation, how the legitimacy of the project of invading Afghanistan, Iraq, politically dominating the Arab and Muslim worlds. It was articulated not just as revenge, it was partly revenge, but it was articulated, and we're liberating them. We're going to liberate these people because that's it's their lack of liberal freedoms that produced the attacks on 9/11. It's actually when the war on terror, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq enter a legitimacy crisis in the United States in the middle part of the decade, when it's clear that they are failing on their own terms, and that instead of being welcomed as liberators, the United States is encountering fierce, determined armed resistance in both Iraq and Afghanistan. It's then that Islamophobia in the United States on the American right truly explodes in a way that we're going to see a direct through line from that Islamophobia. So it's an anti-war Islamophobia, anti-war in a certain way, that lays the groundwork for the Trump Islamophobia.
I mean, from some of my favorite readings of like kind of what happened after the end of 9/11, after 9/11, is that Muslims had always sat as like people who'd been demonized. In fact, if you look at cartoons from the when the oil crisis happened, a lot of them really hold anti-Semitic tropes. All of the Arab
noses.
leaders are depicted
Yeah.
with hook noses,
Yeah.
looking greedy because they've taken all the oil away. And so there was obviously, and I mean, obviously it's not a period I was alive, but I know that it had huge effects. Like, I think there was even a 4-day working week due to lack of oil in the UK and like a rationing of oil, I think. And I know that had always sat there. But after 9/11, I tend to find it quite convincing when people talk about it as the replacement of the Iron Curtain, that Islam and like the values that Muslims have held and continue to hold according to these people, we need to deal with them. We need to change. And right now we're in the process of moving actually towards that with maybe a final assault on Iran. You know, a thorn in America's side since 1979, a place where liberal values have never become ascendant, where they were once ascendant, apparently, under the Shah. And now all of a sudden, we're apparently going back in.
Mini skirt meme.
Yeah, right.
And it's to me, it's like, you know, Fukuyama's End of History was basic. I had never read it, but when I first read it, and it's more about, rather than him actually declaring an end of history, much more like there will be no challenge to liberal values. That would have been a problem. They need this self-legitimizing thing. The Democrats need it too, because they need it for their foreign policy, and they need it for a sort of legion of somewhat well-meaning-ish people who still cling to notions like, oh, we shouldn't go that hard on Israel. We should say that war crimes are bad and taking the West Bank is bad and the two-state solution is good, but we shouldn't go any further than that and talk about decolonization and imagining, you know, a Palestine that is a singular state of all of its citizens because the two-state solution has failed. And I think still they kind of cling to Islam as this kind of cudgel to deflect from everything. I mean, you see people today who maintain that they were against Iraq for their whole life, saying just strike Iran and everything will be fine.
Yeah. No, I think you're right about the end of history, that the idea that they're kind of maybe counterintuitively the prospect of there being unchecked liberal internationalist American hegemony was, for that very same project, that very prospect was kind of paradoxically sort of like an abyss. It needs an enemy, and Islam definitely was. There was a sense of in the 1990s of both post Cold War and post Vietnam, like dysphoria for the American project.
Yeah, which you said has like channels quite a lot into a major ramp up in anti-immigration rhetoric, right? In terms of this becoming like a thing that is now a self-legitimating tool for huge militarization on the border with Mexico.
Right. And now not only on the border, not to jump ahead too much, but obviously on the streets of U.S. cities. And Border Patrol has been on the streets of many U.S. cities for a long time. But this sort of, you know, massive combined agency federal occupation of U.S. cities is certainly a disturbing novel turn, but it's one that has deep roots. If you build a giant repressive infrastructure under the command of the U.S. president, and you build a politics legitimating that giant repressive infrastructure that demonizes outsider others as this existential threat to the United States, it's not so complicated to see how that massive repressive force that you've been built in the hands of an authoritarian fascist like Trump would be used under the pretext of deporting immigrants to massively repress all opposition to his rule, including by shooting U.S. citizens in the head in broad daylight. And just, you go from, 2,000-3,000 Border Patrol agents total in the early 90s to over 20,000 by the time Trump takes office in 2016. So Trump's army was not first and foremost built by Trump. It was built by his bipartisan predecessors.
I remember as well, one of another episode which I've gone back to even recently is Deportation Nation. And I can't remember who it's with, of the Dig.
Is it Chris Newman from the
I
National Day
think it
Labor
is Chris.
Organizing Network?
Yeah. It is him. And one of the things you talk about specifically in there to talk about this topic of Democrats is, I think is it called the Secure Communities Act?
Yes. Yes.
Which is it's where, actually, you know what? If I would prefer it that if you're happy to explain it,
Right.
because it's such a important thing for understanding democratic policies under Obama.
Right. I mean, so beginning in the 1980s, but intensifying under Bill Clinton, you're seeing a massive growth in the immigration enforcement and detention regime, and absolutely alongside this intensified growth of policing and mass incarceration. So these are two processes that are fundamentally intertwined, and they become quite explicitly intertwined through legislation that makes it easier to deport non-citizens who've committed various sorts of crimes. And then what happens is you see an increasing process of creating mechanisms for local law enforcement and jails and prisons to essentially become proxy immigration enforcement officers. And one program is called 287G that I believe is authorized by Bill Clinton in 1990, a law he signs in 1996, but it doesn't take off until quite a few years later. And that basically allows a particular law enforcement agency, a local police department, a state police department, whatever, to sign an agreement with what becomes after 9/11 ICE, to sign an agreement with ICE, basically authorizing it to do immigration enforcement. So that's a big thing. But then there's secure communities, which is more subtle and probably more nefarious, because what it does, and if I remember correctly, it's initiated under Bush but rolled out under Obama. What it does is there's basically like a DHS, ICE, CPB, whatever database of people, and then there's an FBI database of people, and every law enforcement agency in the country, before secure communities, they're hooked up to the FBI database, so that if you get arrested for drunk driving in Boise, Idaho, and they fingerprint you, it goes to the FBI, and they're like, oh, he's wanted for murder, hold that guy. So that what secure communities does is it just merges those systems. And so what happens as a result is, if you are booked into any police station in the country and you're an undocumented immigrant, suddenly under secure communities, ICE is alerted. And what that does is turn essentially every single police department in the country into a proxy ICE agent. And this is what sparks, under Obama, a real explosion of anti-deportation protest. It's very specifically against the Obama administration's imposition of secure communities on localities nationwide. And that's when sanctuary cities are first formed. It's to resist cooperation with ICE under Obama. It's to say, okay, they won't let us opt out of secure communities, so we're going to pass laws that say, hey, local jails, you can't hold people for ICE. Once they're done, you have to just let them out without notifying ICE. That's when sanctuary city laws start coming about. So it's very notable that what we see in Minnesota right now is, and other places, is Trump saying basically, if you don't get in line and cooperate with this institution created by Barack Obama, this Secure Communities program, this is not how it's generally reported and understood, but this is what's happening. if you don't get in line and cooperate in the way with this program rolled out under Barack Obama, that's the easy way. You can do that and have your jails cooperate with ICE, et cetera. Or we'll do it the hard way and we'll occupy your cities and terrorize you.
Yeah.
All you have to do, they finally, seem to have more substantially pulled back from Minnesota. But what they were saying just a week or two ago was like, we won't fully pull out. We won't not fully pull out. We won't really end this massive occupation unless you end all of your sanctuary policies. And where those sanctuary policies come from are resistance to Obama's deportation machine. So there's a great irony there.
Yeah, well, I was about to say, once again, a problem of, I've seen some people say the left read too much and the right don't read at all, because obviously what Trump runs on is, for his first term, right, is Barack Obama has set up all of these woke sanctuary cities that are preventing us doing awesome deportations, and we need to defeat him so he can't do that anymore.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's this woman in San Francisco, Kate Steinle, I think it's like 2015 or something, I could be wrong, is shot and killed by an immigrant in San Francisco who it turns out has like very severe mental illness. And her death becomes a cause celeb for the right, and the accusation from the right and from Trump, who talks about, this young blonde woman who's tragically killed, beautiful Kate. It's he always calls her beautiful in a very creepy way, but very telling what he's up to there in terms of race and sexuality and gender.
Yes.
He's like, it's San Francisco and these loony liberal cities sanctuary policies that are coddling these murderer immigrants. And it's like, these sanctuary policies are a response to grassroots movements in deeper blue states and more democratic strongholds, demanding that local government resist this massive expansion under Obama of immigration enforcement that's turned every police station in the country into a proxy ICE agent.
I guess this kind of brings me, because when I was reading, I can't remember where I read it, but you were talking about like what you kind of view the dig as. And it's funny because it's kind of why I started making TikToks in part, which was like, I don't think academic knowledge about a topic like Palestine, and especially pre-October the 7th, I had an okay size following, but most people weren't interested, but like, you could make them interested. But one of the things that you said is kind of like the mission is to blend academia with like activism, with people who are doing the actual work. And I think on the topic of immigration, what do you think it is that people can actively do to change how immigration is viewed, first of all, and also how immigration operates as a, and I know this is a hugely difficult and broad question, and one that your podcast and life are dedicated to, but like, what are the ways in which you think that kind of occurs, like changing, US policy and imagining a different way that is not this?
Yeah, I mean, a few thoughts. One, I was a young, like 23-year-old activist organizer in 2006, a year of massive pro-immigrant protests in the United States. The most famous day of protest was May Day of that year, where there were millions of people in the streets in cities like, not millions in one city, but total millions out in the streets in Chicago, LA, New York. I was in Portland, Oregon at the time, and I think, could be misremembering, rather small city, and we had like 20,000 people, I believe, out there. And from that moment on, I believe that it's like essential to have institutions that are organizing working class immigrants for collective struggle, and groups like the National Day Laborers Organizing Network, which Chris Newman, whose episode you referenced earlier, Endorsing, has been doing that sort of work really well for a long time. But we need more organizations doing that. We need, obviously, labor unions are critical in doing that. So we need working class immigrant organization. We need what we see from Minneapolis and Chicago and elsewhere. We need forms of popular emergency organization to actually resist ICE once a federal occupation comes. But we also, the answer to like what to do about anti-immigrant politics, my answer is sort of like the same to what do we do about anything? What do we do about the power of, about U.S. support for Israeli settler-colonialism and genocide? What do we do about the like outrageous embargo that's now becoming an asphyxiation of life in Cuba? What do we do about the techno-oligarchy's unbridled economic and political power and wealth and the mass immiseration of working class people in this country? Like, whatever the question is, I also have one more general answer that's always the same to all of them, which is that we need to build left political power, both through savvy organizations that can do things like win elections, but also, very critically, through mass organization. And there are various forms that mass organization can take. Labor unions are a very important one, but they're not the only one. Also, tenant unions are an important emerging kind of experimental sector of organization. The organizers I interviewed in Minneapolis recently were from who were the key organizers in that city in many ways. The head of SEIU Local 26, which represents a lot of immigrant workers in that city. Unidos Minnesota, which represents working class Latinos across the state, or maybe the Minneapolis metro area. And this group, Isaiah, that organizes all sorts of different people, different religious communities, et cetera. And what all these groups that have in common is that they represent masses of people. And it's those base building groups, labor and non-labor, that over a decade plus have been building political power in the Twin Cities. And it's that power, that organized power resting on masses of people, that has allowed for these more not spontaneous, but more short-term emergency forms of resistance to be so effective in that city. And what the left lacks everywhere in this country is sufficient mass organization. In some places, it's really quite thin. And so the way we deal with all of this is building more power and then winning more power and then transforming society so that there's a material basis to a new way of thinking about the world that's embraced by powerful majorities that will sustain us in power as we do deeper non-reformist reforms, winding down the American empire, intensifying social democratic reform as it tips into something that looks more like socialism, et cetera, out onto the horizon.
So, I mean, obviously, I think we spoke about it before, but obviously one of the biggest things and projects you've done and undertaken is Thawra, and Thawra is hyper focused on the Middle East and also the Palestinian cause. Like, what was sort of the logic behind doing it? Just to create like a specific couple of episodes about political organizations in the Middle East, or just what was sort of the driving force behind it?
I mean, the initial idea was sort of to do more or less like a 4-part series. The first 2 episodes with Usama Makdisi on older Ottoman history of the region. And his work is fascinating. It's specifically just on kind of ecumenicism in the Ottoman Mashriq and the Arab lands of the Ottoman Empire, because I mean, such an incredible feature and persistent feature of the Western Orientalism that underlines and legitimates Western imperialism and colonialism in the Middle East is this idea that the Middle East is the kind of home of sectarianism and religious bigotry and all this small-mindedness, when the actual history shows that it's precisely the other way around, and that it's Europe that's historically religiously sectarian and chauvinist, and that it's Europe through its interventions in the Middle East that cultivates the salience of religious difference in the region, and that makes religious difference into a point of violent conflict. So had that conversation with Usama Makdisi, and then, I knew in more broad strokes that there had been, since the conclusion of World War I, when the Western powers consolidated their colonial rule over the Arab Middle East, that there had been various anti-colonial political projects. I knew that Nasser in Egypt had been an important figure in Arab nationalism, and that there had been other nationalist projects. I knew that Baathism had been powerful, had taken power in Iraq and Syria and been influential throughout the region. And I knew that it was a mix of nationalism and socialism and other things that I hadn't quite grasped yet. And I knew that Iraq had an extraordinarily powerful communist party. These are all things that I knew, but I didn't know much more than that. So I contacted Abed Takriti because, honestly, there's just no region in the world where there has been a more multifarious creative diversity of efforts to figure out how to throw off colonial and imperial rule. And those efforts unfortunately were often at war with themselves, as something that comes up quite frequently through Tharwa. Like, look at the Baathists and communists in Iraq. But the idea, I said this at the top of our discussion, the fundamental idea with both Tharwa, with Abed, which, started out as a 2-part thing and then became like, oh, maybe it's 5 parts, then became 19 parts. And my shorter but really excellent conversations with Usama Makdisi, all of them were about, through just rigorous historical exposition, exploding the Orientalist myths that have long sustained and continue to sustain Western imperialism and colonialism in the region. That was the basic idea. And to understand that the Palestinian struggle was part of a much broader pan-Arab struggle, anti-colonial struggle in the region, and continues to be so today, even after so many really horrible defeats of Arab revolutionary movements. And that's kind of where the series ends, really, in Beirut, with the PLO evacuation, which really does kind of signal the end of an era of secular nationalist, communist, socialist revolution being overwhelmingly the dominant force in anti-colonial struggle across the Arab world, to forms of Islamist resistance kind of filling that void. And it's and that's so important to understand, because, again, in the Orientalist essentializing of ahistorical essentializing of the Middle East, it's this idea that, like, oh, these people are like, pre-modern religious fundamentalists, barbarians. It's like it's like the 20th century politics of the Arab East were fundamentally about figuring out how to be free in the modern world. And it's only after the brutally barbaric and backward and medieval European and Western and American destruction of those movements that you see the rise of more reactionary religious formulations to fill that void. And so that, for me, that is such an important point, because it is so racist and so wrong.
Yeah. It also takes away culpability of the Western powers in this situation. Like Israel is a good example where you see Hamas and you see Zionists kind of fantasize about a possibility where, oh, well, why couldn't the Palestinian resistance be secular and leftist and human? But it was for the longest time.
Yeah.
And these Israelis actually aided Hamas to stifle the secular Palestinian resistance because it was actually serving as a potentially threatening force to the Zionist project. And also in Iran, Iran's a good example. Like the Shah, with his Western backing, focused on suppressing his more Mossadegh secular leftist opposition as opposed to, hyperfixating on the more religious opposition. And just by a concoction of all of these factors, you end up in a situation where the West has exacerbated the very thing in the region, the Islamism, that they complain about.
And in Iran, of course, after overthrowing Mossadegh for the crime of Iran nationalizing its oil, overthrowing Mossadegh, who was essentially like a social democrat, who, at a time when Iran also had an extraordinarily powerful communist party, Tuda, but Mossadegh was a social democrat who wanted nothing more for the subsoil resources of Iran than Britain at the time expected of its own.
Yeah, to fuel a dying empire, because it was like one of the last cash cows that Britain had, and losing it was so terrible. But ironically, because of Churchill's lobbying of the Americans, they ended up with a worse deal than they would have got out of Mossadegh. If they'd just been like, yep, I think Britain ended up with 20% of 50%, whereas they might have even been able to cut like some 20% of the 100%, like 80% to the Iranians, and offered support for because obviously nationalizing your oil is like objectively a really good thing. However, simultaneously, it does require expertise and the development of expertise. And obviously, one of the things that they didn't really do prior to oil nationalization was allow people who actually lived there to learn how to do that.
Well, I was going to say also in the instance of like Cuba, you look at Cuba and you see the Americans demonize Cuba for the way that it is today and fail to address their input in that situation. I can't remember who said it, but maybe it was Castro who said, "You criticize the way we breathe, but you forgot the fact that you strangled us," or something like that.
It's the Cuba point is so important because I am like a democratic socialist in the sense that I believe in full popular democratic control over both the economy and the political system. And obviously there are things about the Cuban order that don't comport with my vision here. But the history of why why Cuba is the way it is go back to Guatemala and what Che and Castro learned when the Arbenz government there, again, like Mossadegh, right around the same time in the early 1950s, was a social democratic. Was a 1 or 2 years after. Was a social democratic government who had the temerity to engage in some modest land redistribution and to legalize the Communist Party. And what the Dulles brothers and U.S. Empire did in, homage to the United Fruit Company was to exploit every liberal democratic opening in the regime to destabilize it, mount a coup that brought down the government. The CIA brought down the government and instituted a decades-long reign of terror against the people of Guatemala, and more specifically, a genocide against the Mayan people of Guatemala.
Yeah.
And Che, if I remember correctly, was in Guatemala.
Yeah.
In that period. And Che and Castro saw that if you allow certain liberal freedoms that I support as a general principle, that the empire will exploit them to destroy your project, even if it's merely modestly social democratic. And that's what that lesson Castro took to Allende.
As I was just going to say that.
To the coup there, and said, "Watch out."
And he gave him a gun, AK,
and said you should arm your people. And so I can't. We have not given Cuba the opportunity to freely develop as a democratic society. Cuba has been under siege since they had the temerity to throw off the yoke of U.S. empire with the Cuban Revolution.
Yeah. My next video is this huge deep dive into Cuba, dating all the way back to 1511 with the conquest of Diego de la Vasquez. I can't remember how you say that. But the thing with Cuba that's so interesting is a lot of people, they'll start the history right at the revolution, which is obviously a very important part. But even before that, like once the Americans took over the Spanish colonies, they enacted in the Cuban Constitution, they enacted the Platt Amendment, which basically said that the Americans, and this was at the turn of the 20th century, I believe, they could do whatever they want in Cuba. They could interject militarily, they could set up naval bases, they could control their economy, they can control their foreign relations. This is well before the revolution. So you have this nationalist sentiment in Cuba where they want to throw off the yoke of they just did with the Spanish, the people who won the insurgency against the Spanish in Cuba were the Cuban rebels, headed by Jose Marti. Of course, he died before they won. But what the Americans did was they used an explosion off the coast of Cuba in one of the ships as a pretense to join the war against Spain, and then took over Cuba after the rebels did all the work. So you have
Puerto
this
Rico
long,
and the Philippines,
and Guam, and you have like this long history in Cuba where it's just been colonization by the Spanish, neo-colonization by the Americans, and then you finally throw off the Fulgencio Batista regime in '59, and then you get sanctioned by the Americans. So it's like, what the fuck? What are they supposed to do?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's and what's I think people have been grimly correct to analogize what we're seeing in Cuba right now to what we saw in Gaza, just like, organized starvation as an imperial political tactic as just like normal and okay.
Another thing I wanted to mention really quick, because we mentioned about how in the Middle East, the colonial powers will point to Islam and say, why couldn't the resistance be non-Islamic, secular leftist? And in Cuba, they'll look to Cuba and be like, why does Cuba have to be communist? Fidel wasn't even communist in the beginning. Like the revolution at first was more so inspired by Jose Marti, the nationalist movement, than it was by Marx. Sure. And Castro was like, he put the conservative people into his government trying to appeal to America, and they shot that down, right? He turned to the Soviet Union after that.
Yeah. I mean, I believe Ho Chi Minh had a similar trajectory in terms of, I don't mean to kind of, who am I to call Ho Chi Minh naive in a condescending way, but like, he was like, he was like, oh, you'll agree with these principles of overthrowing colonialism, right? And the U.S. is like, no, actually, we are taking over for the French now that they're exhausted. And I mean, similar to Hugo Chavez. Chavez was radicalized by the U.S. coup against him pretty dramatically.
Yeah. I bring this point up in the video that I'm working on, but the Americans love to romanticize their own revolution. But then when a revolution happens in the developing world, and even in some cases when that revolution is directly inspired by the American Revolution, all of a sudden it's a horrific act that shouldn't have occurred.
The story from the Haitian Revolution that many French revolutionaries were shocked when they heard the Haitians singing the same songs that they'd sung just a few years earlier, and that they apparently had to bring the Haitians, they had to bring them to heel when all people wanted was freedom based on the same principles that they had just advocated for freedom on. Obviously, it's, it's not saying like, oh, the French did this so sadly. I mean, they were very happy with it, many of them. And for many years, they made Haiti suffer and still do. But still, simultaneously, you kind of see this like connection between all of these. And I mean, one of the most significant books I read, I remember when I was like first went to university to study the Middle East was Justice Interrupted by Elizabeth Thompson, which is just like a load of details of some like smaller movements, some like larger movements. So there's mentions of Comrade Fard in Iraq, who was smeared as, some Soviet guy, but actually he was really locally popular. His funding was all local. And, we were told that, they were told at the time that he was like this awful character. And it ends with the Arab Spring. And many people have perceptions about the Arab Spring. But what I will say about it is it just showed you that people in the Middle East don't want to live under authoritarian dictatorships. It actually showed you as well that many people in the Middle East don't like it, and people are entitled to this opinion, whether they are leftists or not, but that there is a democratic trend in Islam. There are scholars who argue this, and they talk about, particularly in the Sunni tradition, they draw from the succession of the Prophet and how, it was appointed based on a decision as opposed to being related to a lineage. And so, the notions that many people have about the Middle East, what they don't understand is much of this is inflected by colonialism, and all of those clash of civilization arguments are reliant on one thing, which is Islam has a through line from 500, 600 AD until now, when it has had very different periods. It's had periods and it's had different sects. Some sects which embrace drinking and mysticism as a means to get closer towards God. And I think that that's kind of like what I like about, I think it's great that so many people have studied Palestine, but I think it is of paramount importance that people understand the wider Middle East, to understand, hey, there are very different revolutionary movements and divergent political thought across every single country in the MENA region.
And on the Shia side of the ledger, there, the Islamic Revolution and the currents of Islamic ideology circulating through it are not what people would expect. People should take a close look at Shariati's
yes.
politics. It'll just kind of confound presumptions about the role of Islam in the region.
Even reading about that recently, it talks about how there are a lot of different Shia clerics with opinions, some who kind of moderate Khomeini at times, some people who offer like a moderation to him and like something that is not, straight up, that is not so religiously, that doesn't believe that, I think it's called Velayat-i-Faq, which is like the guardianship of the Prophet.
Mm-hmm.
I think what they're saying, what the argument is like, no, the Prophet should just have an entirely spiritual role. And obviously now that's changed a lot, and they have a lot more central of like a governing role.
Right.
And I think, sorry, as it is.
No, I don't want to cut you off, because I was going to move to a different question.
Yeah, no, feel free. Feel free to.
Something I was curious to kind of pick your brain about, Daniel, was we spoke about immigration a little earlier in the episode, and we are kind of talking about Cuba right now. Do you notice how among the right in America, for some reason, the Cuban immigrant is treated a lot better than, say, the Mexican immigrant? And there was actually a YouTube video
in the law historically.
Mm-hmm. There's a video I think Steven Crowder made not too long ago, where he was going to interview immigrants, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, but essentially what ended up happening was he interviewed a Mexican dude, and he's like, see how this Mexican guy doesn't like America? And then he interviewed a Cuban dude, and he's like, see how this Cuban dude's so awesome, and he like loves America, and he's conservative. It's always been I guess that's something to do with like the diaspora of an adversarial country that comes to America, and then those immigrants are used as a token.
Yeah, this is something we've seen very frequently throughout U.S. history, where the people fleeing a regime that the U.S. empire doesn't like are exalted, like Cubans, and those who are fleeing a regime that the U.S. does like and is backing, let's say like the death squad government in El Salvador, those people are persecuted and demonized. And I think actually under Trump, we're seeing a bit of a change that's interesting and tells us something about the evolution of reactionary political culture in the United States, which is that you had the intense demonization of the Maduro regime, and simultaneously an intense demonization of the Venezuelan migrants fleeing the economic crisis and political repression in Venezuela. So that's weird, kind of historically. You both had all Venezuelan migrants are trained al agua, and Maduro is the devil and persecuting his people. It's contradictory.
Yeah.
And the contradiction doesn't matter, because contradictions in right-wing and far-right politics don't matter. In fact, in a variety of ways, they're constitutive of the sort of like schizophrenic power of those politics.
Actually, you know what? I know that you've been speaking to a lot of like experts on Venezuela. What is your take on this whole thing of like
getting called an apologist for American empire in my,
really?
By certain people? Yeah, whatever. I mean, it's like, for me, it's like I've spent a lot of time living in Latin America. I'm very close to the Latin American left and the left in a lot of different countries in Latin America, and like we're not like, it's just like not credible to like not tell the truth about the Maduro government there. It's not credible to Latin Americans, and it's not like if we pretend something else is going on there than what has been going on there, that the U.S. empire is going to be like, oh, okay, never mind, we're not going to invade that country. I'm not saying that people shouldn't. I'm not saying that it's not incumbent upon us to not demonize the Venezuelan government. But anyhow,
I agree. Like, there's a lot to criticize with Maduro, especially like even his economic policies. Like, there are economic suggestions coming from his left. Like, I remember there was the whole thing where people were telling him to unify the two currencies, and he didn't do it. But regardless, like, I just don't really buy into the idea that the Americans give a shit about authoritarianism or dictatorship. If you're going to tell me like you're going to go there to overthrow a dictator, all right, buddy, go overthrow Saudi Arabia or UAE or whatever.
Well, and kind of like in a shockingly blunt manner, Trump proved that by just removing literally the person of Maduro while elevating his vice president to take his place. I mean, I was a dedicated Chavista. I went to Venezuela multiple times under Chavez. I saw Chavez speak. I think Chavez was an amazing revolutionary figure whose probably biggest mistake was like lining up Maduro to be his successor. But that said, at the end of the day, like the Venezuelan economy would not have cracked the way it did even without the U.S. sanctions, and the U.S. knew its sanctions were going to crack Venezuela's economy. There's the Washington Post did an interesting series of investigations showing that this was clearly understood, and they did it anyways.
I mean, even watching today, like I think it was Nancy Mace was no, it wasn't. It wasn't. Who was it? I can't believe I've forgotten her name. Nancy Pelosi, not Nancy Mace. Nancy Pelosi was talking today about like the means to collapse Iran. And it's like, and once again, I think probably, I know what you're talking about here, because like when we spoke about Maduro, we didn't like, say, oh, he's like amazing, he's this great guy. But like when it comes to Iran, like reading about protests there, and I read something that came from some guy who was like, his Twitter posting is insane, but his reads of previous revolutionary movements in Iran, and I've always felt like I knew a lot of Iranians, I met a lot of Iranians who were leftists, who, weren't like these kind of crazy Shah people that you meet who are monarchists, who love Israel, just mass killing people who are really repugnant to deal with and are people who push you away from the Iranian movement. But so many of these people I met were just like, yeah, things are bad, being a young person growing up there, it's difficult, we experience things that are real. And so when we talk about it, it's like, I can't sit there and just be like, actually, things are awesome. And I do really struggle when, someone who I do feel aligned with sometimes on a lot of Palestine policy is just like, actually, no, the treatment of women in Iran is just excellent. And it's like, no, that's really
false.
Tough for me. It's really tough for me to sit there and believe that I have to say that to advocate for us not bombing them.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, and what the important thing to emphasize is that U.S. imperialism in all of these cases intensifies the bad things happening in those countries. The political, the closing of the political system. There is a historically vibrant contestation after the Islamic Revolution amidst the mass repression of the 1980s and other things. There's reformist politics. There's all kinds of different, political forces in Iran contesting for power and for the trajectory of the revolution and of the Islamic State. And U.S. imperialism hems that all in, empowers, the so-called hardliners.
Sure.
And that's what we see everywhere, because the U.S. will exploit any liberal democratic opening in your system. This goes back to our discussion on Guatemala, to destroy you. And that encourages political authoritarianism.
Well, funnily enough, it was I believe it was 1960 under Eisenhower. There was something called the Mallory Memo, which essentially stated that it was an inquiry into the state in Cuba, and it stipulated that the majority of Cubans really loved Castro. Like, they were happy with the revolution. They liked him. That he had the vast majority of support, and that the only way the Americans could change that was through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship, and that the American government had to bring into Cuba a state of hunger, desperation in order to overthrow the government. Like, this is all in the Mallory Memo. So again, then you look at Cuba today.
That's the playbook everywhere.
Yeah. You look at Cuba today and you complain, you go, oh, it's authoritarian, it's this, that. Well, they were happy with what they had before, and then you kind of nurtured any sort of authoritarian tendency that may exist.
And also, like, in the context of somewhere like Iran or Venezuela, corruption is always going to worsen when you're doing things through, like, shadow fleets and through, who is that accountable to? If these are all, like, bizarre front companies, the power is just going to concentrate in the hands of a small amount of people who are able to enrich themselves massively thanks to sanctions and thanks to being able to cut very dodgy deals with money that is not going to be flowing out to your population, while simultaneously the rest of your population, you can't even profit off having, like, a devalued currency because you cannot really trade with anyone. And so it's kind of like this situation in which I definitely reckon with that, and I definitely understand that, but I will not, like, apologize and pretend that most likely Iran hasn't engaged in brutal repression. I won't believe perhaps, like, every single figure that I'm told and see, but simultaneously, they've killed hundreds and over 1,000 people in a protest before. The internet went off for a reason, and in certain restive parts of Iran, in, like, places like the Kurdish regions, the Baluch regions, where there's a history of militancy and people who have weapons and stuff. It doesn't surprise me that there are, like, people who engage in militant uprisings in these spaces.
And people on the left, that does not complicate our analysis, because that blood is also on the hands of American empire. Because when the U.S. empire is waging nonstop war against all of these places all over the country, amongst many horrible things that's doing, is effectuating the militarization and securitization of those societies and governments to protect themselves from U.S. imperialism. You are empowering and emphasizing the role of the security state within all of these places, inevitably to defend themselves, and that is not good. And we can look all the way back to the early wars against the Bolshevik revolution to understand the distortions caused by imperialist powers waging war against socialist or decolonizing projects. It does introduce, like, really unfortunate distortions.
Hamas, everyone says that they did a coup. They didn't really do a coup. They launched a preemptive coup because they knew that the US was going to coup them if they didn't, because they let them run in an election that then they decided no, they couldn't win that election and they couldn't have any power, and so they had to be couped. And now people today are like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that they kill collaborators. And it's like, yeah, that's a really, there are many questions around the first Intifada of, like, hey, some people were definitely killed who were just not collaborators, who were just average people. But because Israel exists in a way where they actually exploit things in society, like, for example, people who are drug users, people who are gay. Apparently, one of the first words that the Israelis learn in their Arabic classes for the military is the word gay, because they know they can catch a gay Palestinian who may have familial or community, like people who are not open to that kind of stuff. And all of a sudden they're like, you're going to tell us stuff, or your family is going to know, and they are going to cause issues for you, or your community is going to know, and people there may hold homophobic or regressive beliefs. And you kind of see these situations in which where people are pushed towards these more militarized and assaults on things like people who, use drugs and stuff as basically a means of securing their own power and finding people who they think might be exploited, or they deem to be, might be likely to be a collaborator. That person may be killed totally unjustly, And I think this all taps into this stuff of like seeing it much more as like, hey, you can confront these authoritarian tendencies that don't really factor into politics that we might like, but it's important to see them actually as a production of what the context in which they exist.
Yeah, I think we've covered it, but in some, I think there's our duty as Marxists is ruthless criticism of everything that exists, and it is it's just like wrong to be dishonest in our analysis, including problems of governments, regimes that are the target of U.S. imperialist power. That said, our politics must understand that our responsibility, first and foremost, as people in the United States or Canada or Britain or in the West, is to remove the imperialist boot off the neck of these societies, because that is first and foremost the key driver of regressive and authoritarian politics in the countries and societies that are under the boot of Western imperialism.
And I mean, there's a brilliant article by Rayma Hamimi called The Hijab and the Intifada. And she talks about like how actually a lot of women were alienated, not because like previously no one had ever worn a hijab, but because in Gaza it started becoming enforced, and like young men would like chase after women and they'd be like, hey, you're not being a proper revolutionary because you're not respecting the martyrs who've died as a result of the Intifada. And she talks about how actually a lot of leftist women in the West Bank in particular felt really upset at the leadership of the Intifada because they weren't issuing any declaration saying, you cannot harass women, you cannot do these things. And this comes from a Palestinian, and it is not to tap into this notion that Palestinians are backwards or really just want everyone to be wearing a hijab, but rather to actually say, like, the hijab has a context in which it exists. People do undeniably wear it, but it being enforced is not actually something that people love.
No, and clearly don't love in Iran either.
We had one other Palestine question, which I'm very interested in asking you about, because I know that you were a big Bernie guy, right? Like you were advocating for him.
Yes. Are we going to talk about Bernie's various shortcomings on the subject?
Yeah. No. Well, we kind of phrased it as like betrayal, right, Isaac?
Right.
We're wondering, do you feel a sense of betrayal?
So it's a complicated question to answer. I mean, in short, on some level, yes. And I still believe that the politics that Bernie represents and still leads more broadly is the best hope for building the political power in this country that we need to cut off military aid to Israel and bring the apartheid state to its knees. So both Bernie and AOC have taken positions that I think are just wrong at various points, politically and morally, ethically. Bernie, in the length of time it took him to call what was clearly happening in Gaza a genocide. AOC for supporting Iron Dome as if there's any sort of distinction between offensive and defensive military power. I mean, from a military perspective, there's absolutely no distinction. Defensive military capabilities are what enhances your offensive military capabilities.
Defenses
your best defense is a good offense, or best offense is a good defense. There are phrases that make sense.
Like funding the defense for the genocidal settler colony is still insane.
Right.
Yeah.
That said, AOC and Bernie have been, from rather early on, the key leaders in the U.S. Congress to cut off most military aid to Israel with the Block the Bombs Act. Bernie in the Senate and AOC in the House have been at the lead of building the political coalitions that are expanding to include increasing swaths of liberals in both chambers that will eventually get to the majority we need to cut Israel off. So I think we need to be just like clear-eyedly critical, like bluntly critical to AOC and Bernie on both of those points, while understanding that on Palestine in particular, and in terms of the political transformation that this country requires more broadly, that the political bloc they're building is by far the best hope that we have to undertake the changes that we need, both domestically and internationally. And these are the contradictions that, if we dedicate ourselves to a project of efficacious political struggle rather than just commitment to abstract ideals, these are contradictions that we have to move through with our eyes wide open.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like, obviously Corbyn is an interesting character, because Corbyn has obviously shown Corbyn has been much stronger than both AOC and Bernie. But there was a very interesting point earlier this year where Zara Sultana would say it, but he wouldn't, that he was anti-Zionist. He refused to use the term anti-Zionist. And even though he
clearly is. That's interesting.
I think, to be honest, he first of all, I think he's quite old now, unfortunately, for when if he had been, it's ironic, if he'd run in 2024 and if he'd been Labour leader then, he probably would have won, because the anti-Semitism thing would not have hit in the same way.
Totally.
Yeah.
But then, they probably would have been something else. He probably would have apparently been, I don't know, Hamas's number one fan, because he said one time, "Where's our friends from Hezbollah and Hamas," or something. But he refused to say it, and it disappoints me, and it's something that I'd be like, hey, I don't like that. But if he stood as the leader of a party, and your party, the most horribly named party in the world, if he stood as the leader of that and it was serious and it wasn't in the quagmire it's been in recently, perhaps I would have more interest. I would be happy to vote for it, because he is someone who has been so principled on Palestine. He is someone who's been so principled on, Palestine action and stuff, and speaking out today. And whenever you see him appear in the media about something like Venezuela, it is like, wow, this is refreshing to hear from a British politician, someone who nearly led Britain, who is like, oh, it's totally wrong to go in and kidnap.
Anti-imperialism's just bedrock for him.
Yeah. And it's just like, and so I think it's interesting of just kind of the way in which you view things. I do find interesting, because obviously online it's very different. A lot of people are quicker to cast opinions, and I think that there are things in which, I do see why people are so mad at Bernie Sanders, because the genocide thing for me is, it's really egregious, because especially when you learn about other genocides all over the world and the way in which they just continue happening and seemingly never ending in Sudan, whether that's what Saddam did to the Kurds, and the way in which Kurds have never seen any account. Well, I think some German companies were held to account for selling Saddam weapons, chemical weapons. But I think that really upsets me, and I worry sometimes as well that when some people get power, it feels like they really just misuse it and betray, if you know what I mean.
Right.
Like Starmer.
Right. I think the social media maybe encourages this, is either AOC and Bernie are our perfect heroes, or they're absolutely the worst thing that's happened. They've betrayed everything, that you believe them, that they betray every single bit of faith that you've put in them. And I think actually doing politics, and if we look to, again, Latin America, where I've spent a lot of time over the years, the actual kind of contradictions and complexities of the left actually governing, that we have to think somewhat different about how to do politics and how to think about our political leaders. And we can say things like Bernie and AOC really missed the moment here. And there's a reason why AIPAC's top priority is shutting down everything about the political movement that they're at the lead of. I mean, that like I feel like when people they must critique AOC and Bernie for these positions. But when they stop there and are unable to zoom out and take stock of why do Israel's primary political agents in the United States, why is it their top priority to destroy Bernie and AOC's political movement? If people on the left can't then appreciate that, then they're not thinking with the sorts of strategic frameworks that we're going to need to win power and transform this country, which will not be flipping some sort of switch where we go from horrible political leaders to great ones. Mm-hmm. It'll be a process of struggle, including like look at Zoran in New York. Zoran broke new ground that AOC and Bernie had not by refusing to budge from anti-Zionism. That was historic. Recently, he, in response to what I would describe as sort of provocative ultra forms of chants at a protest in New York, referred to Hamas as a terrorist organization. I think that is an incredibly problematic category that's fundamentally caught up in the Israeli legitimation of apartheid and genocide in Palestine. Mm-hmm. But if I take that critique and then say everything about Zoran is bad, it's not significant that he's never backed down from anti-Zionism, that's not right. Like I have a critique of what he said there, in a serious one. But there's a lot of other stuff going on.
That makes sense. I'm a lot more favorable to that argument, especially when it comes to Zoran, because there is seemingly more principled anti-Zionism coming from him. My big concern with a guy like Bernie is, although I agree 100%, he is obviously a thorn in AIPAC's side. He is kind of in bed with J Street, which is just like the liberal Zionist AIPAC. So my concern with him is like,
I would say he's closer to JVP I would say he's closer to JVP these days. I can't speak specifically about his history with J Street. I mean, J Street's almost like, does J Street matter in the year 2026? I feel like it's kind of, they've rendered themselves pretty historically irrelevant since.
Maybe I'm just still mad at him for taking so long to call it a genocide. Totally. And then when he did, the first thing he did was, and the first thing he did when he wrote that letter was condemn Hamas. So I'm like, come on, man.
Yeah, no, and that sucks. And this is like, this is a hard thing to think through, but to think of like, okay, like what are the actual balance of forces in this country? Like generally, which forces is someone like Bernie at the lead of strengthening, and then have all of those critiques.
That makes sense.
But critique, and this is, I'm thinking back to, everyone on the Anglophone left loves Lula these days. I remember in the aughts during the first pink tide, when Lula was very much seen as the right of the first pink tide, with Chavez and Evo on the left. And a lot of people on the Anglophone left were very influenced by PSOL, the more radical left party in Brazil, and had a very kind of like strong critique of Lula. And in fact, I think a lot of those critiques remain very interesting and important. And, any Latin American left government has, put Cuba aside for a moment, including Scheinbaum, has made all sorts of different different compromises with the status quo, whether it's Scheinbaum's relationship with Carlos Slim, Brazil's relationship to the agribusiness sector that is incredibly important for export earnings, but is also the material basis of political reaction in that country. Anywhere we look across Latin America and the Latin American left, we see contradiction. And contradiction is always part of governance. And so I think I want to both push back against anyone who's like, we can't criticize AOC, Bernie, or Zoran, and against an assessment that's because these people have done things that are wrong or taken positions that are wrong, we need to throw out everything about the political project that they're a part of entirely, because AIPAC would like nothing more than us doing just that.
I also tend to find, and one of the things I think about this a lot is I read a lot, and most of the people that I'm reading, I don't always really share every opinion of or with. And I mean, like, just behind me is The People Want by Gilbert Achcar, which is a pretty good reading of the economics of the Arab Spring. But also, I think Gilbert Achcar's got some pretty problematic views around Palestine, or I've heard people say that he has sometimes had some problematic views around Palestine because they don't align entirely. But that doesn't mean I'd throw out all of his work, and that I'd say, well, I can't read anything because they don't agree with me entirely. And I think if you don't really bother reading, and maybe it isn't just reading, but like I would rather welcome people in and try and convince them to why I feel a way about something than instantaneously dismissing them and treating everyone I meet who doesn't think exactly like me with aggro. Because across, like, I don't know, when you're in person and you do, like, I'm not going to sit here and pretend, I've spent my life organizing. We did a lot of stuff around Palestine-related activism on campus, and I'm sure not everyone there felt the same as me. And I'm sure, and there were definitely red lines that had to be drawn. And like, if someone behaves a certain way, if someone continually says things that are just inappropriate and people can't really deal with, and that cause friction to a point where it's just like, you are abandoning this and causing problems for the majority of people, it is okay to draw red lines as well. But also, I don't want to just treat every single person who might be who is open to what I believe about the world as just a political enemy, if you know what I mean. Thank you guys for listening to another episode of No Politic here. And thank you, Daniel, for coming on. And I mean, if people want to find you, it's probably best to go through The Dig, right? And which is your podcast.
Yeah. I am on social media under my full name, but the podcast, The Dig, is where I do most of my public expression.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. And
thank you so much, Daniel.
Thank you both. Really good talking to you.
Yeah, thank you for a very productive conversation.